You know, when you unroll a massive, detailed schematic of a modern city, you are essentially looking at this triumph of compartmentalization.
Oh, absolutely. It's all about keeping things in their own little boxes.
Right. We've engineered our physical world to be so cleanly separated into these distinct systems. Like the water grid runs its course over here, and then the power grid is this completely separate overlay over there.
Yeah, you've got traffic flow, waste management, telecommunications. I mean, each one has its own dedicated layer.
Exactly. So if a water main bursts and floods a street, the city engineer doesn't go look at the power grid, you know?
Right. They point at the broken pipe, they isolate the valve, and they just fix that one localized problem.
It is a very clean, very linear, and honestly a deeply satisfying way to manage complexity.
It is. I mean, it gives us this incredible sense of control. We inherently prefer our problems to be neatly categorized like that.
We really do.
Because when a system is modular, a failure in one sector doesn't inevitably mean the total collapse of the whole city. It's a
Yeah.
very comfortable way to view the world.
But, and here's where it gets tricky. The moment you pivot from urban engineering to the actual living architecture of human society, that neat little map becomes entirely useless.
Completely useless, yeah.
You look at economics, morality, social decay, the justice system, and suddenly you aren't dealing with separate layers anymore.
No, you're looking at a deeply entangled, almost like biological organism.
Yes, a biological organism. If crime spikes, you can't just look at the police force. You have to look at the education system.
Right. And if the education system is failing, well, then you have to look at household economics.
Exactly. Which means a failure in one area is never isolated. It is entirely systemic.
You're describing the fundamental difference between, mechanical engineering and social physics.
Social physics, I love that term. And that is exactly what we are getting into today. Welcome to this deep dive.
Glad to be here for this one.
Whether you are, prepping for a high-level policy meeting, or maybe you're just trying to make sense of our modern economic anxieties, or, and this is my favorite, simply chasing that profound, perspective-shifting realization about how the world actually works, we are thrilled to have you with us.
It's going to be a good one.
Today, we are exploring a concept that takes those supposedly isolated issues, so poverty, education, social decay, and justice, and maps them out as one massive interconnected mechanism.
Right, a single blueprint.
Yeah. We're calling this framework the equilibrium of a just society. And our source material for this is really fascinating. We are looking at lecture 617 of the Tului Islam series.
Which is incredibly dense material, by the way.
Oh, very. Specifically, we're analyzing Surah 17, also known as Surah Bani Israel, verses 29 through 33. And we're viewing this through the analytical lens of the scholar Ghulam Ahmad Parwez.
And, the material we're covering today is so ambitious because it flat out refuses to treat human suffering as a series of isolated accidents.
Right. It's not just bad luck.
Exactly. Parwez's interpretation of these specific verses, it doesn't just offer these nice moral platitudes. It actually presents a comprehensive, interlocking socioeconomic blueprint.
And what would you say is the primary goal of that blueprint? Like, what's the thesis here?
Well, the primary goal of his interpretation is really to challenge our most fundamental assumptions about resource management.
Okay, how so?
It attempts to completely shift the paradigm. So moving away from the management of inevitable scarcity and shifting toward the cultivation of natural abundance.
Man, that shift from scarcity to abundance, that is the perfect place to start because it dictates literally everything else in this blueprint.
It really does. It's the foundation.
So let's look at the baseline of the societal equilibrium, right? How we handle physical resources.
Okay.
Surah 17, Ayat 29, introduces this very physical, very striking metaphor regarding wealth.
The hand metaphor, yeah.
Exactly. The text commands the reader. It says, do not keep your hand tied to your neck, nor extend it completely.
Right. And the imagery of the hand there is just a brilliant rhetorical device.
Because it's so visceral.
Yes, because it takes this super abstract macroeconomic concept and makes it intimately physically personal.
So let's unpack the mechanics of that. What do these two extremes actually represent in Parwez's economic framework? Let's start with the first one.
Okay, so the first extreme, the hand tied to the neck.
Yeah.
This symbolizes pathological stinginess.
Okay.
It's the obsessive hoarding of wealth. So when we translate this into actual economic behavior, hoarding is the act of pulling capital out of circulation.
So it's stagnation.
Total stagnation, yes.
The wealth effectively ceases to exist for the rest of society,
Yeah.
right? Like it's locked in a vault somewhere, entirely unproductive.
Precisely. And an economy relies entirely on velocity. It
Yeah.
needs flow.
Right, the velocity of money.
Yeah. So when wealth is hoarded by a select few, the broader economic engine it seizes up.
Because there's no fuel reaching the rest of the engine?
Exactly. And the text argues that this behavior directly creates destitution. And it's critical to note, not because the resources don't physically exist on the planet.
Wait, so the resources are there?
Yes, they exist. But the resources required for other people to survive, to innovate, to produce, they are trapped. They're artificially locked away.
Okay, that makes total sense. So what about the other side of the verse?
Conversely, you have the completely extended hand, and that represents the sheer opposite, which is reckless extravagance and squandering.
Just like burning through capital without any strategic thought for the future.
Right, just blind consumption. And that kind of overspending, it might create a temporary illusion of economic activity.
Sure. People are buying things, it looks busy.
Exactly, it looks like a boom. But it actually destroys individual and familial stability in the long run.
Because there's no foundation.
Right. The verse suggests that this inevitably leads to a state of, quote, blame and regret.
Blame and regret. Wow.
Yeah, a person, or even an entire society, becomes destitute through their own total lack of discipline. So the core argument the text is making here really revolves around the concept of liquidity.
Liquidity, okay.
Wealth has to act like a current. It needs to constantly, sustainably move to, water the fields of the broader society.
Okay, that makes me think of a water reservoir model.
Oh, I like that. Go on.
So imagine a massive river flowing through a valley.
Right.
And it's sustaining several towns downstream.
Okay.
If an entity comes along and builds a towering concrete dam and completely stops the flow, which is the hand tied to the neck, the towns downstream experience this devastating drought.
Right. The crops fail, the people suffer.
Exactly. But if you swing to the other extreme and you just say, okay, let's detonate the dam entirely, which is the completely extended hand, you don't solve the problem either.
Right, because then you get a flood.
Yes. The water rushes through in this catastrophic, completely unregulated flood. It washes away all the topsoil, it vanishes into the ground, and a month later, what happens?
The towns are dying of thirst again.
Exactly. They're still dying of thirst. So the text seems to be arguing for a managed, continuous flow. The infrastructure itself must prioritize circulation.
That analogy perfectly illustrates the text's stance on human intervention. And actually, this brings us to a rather radical claim within the source material.
Oh, what's the claim?
Parwez argues that nature itself, the physical world, has not placed hard, impenetrable barriers on resources that would naturally cause mass starvation.
Wait, really? So he's saying physical scarcity isn't the default?
Right. He's saying the bottlenecks are almost entirely artificial. They are human-made systems.
Wow. Okay.
And he specifically points to the concept of unlimited private property, without any structural caps or limits, as one of these primary artificial dams.
Okay, I have to push back on that a little bit.
Go for it.
If the text insists that resources are naturally abundant that the Earth is completely capable of sustaining its population if the flow is just managed correctly, how do we square that with the psychological reality we all live in?
What do you mean?
Well, why is the feeling of absolute scarcity pretty much the defining characteristic of modern life? I mean, our entire global economic philosophy, from how we price basic goods to how we negotiate our salaries, it is all built on the fundamental assumption that there is simply not enough to go around.
It's a great point, and the text actually acknowledges that reality. But it frames it as a symptom of a psychological pathology rather than a physical truth.
A psychological pathology, so it's in our heads.
Essentially, yes. The assertion is that we have institutionalized a fear of scarcity because our historical systems, for centuries, allowed for infinite hoarding.
Right, the kings and empires taking everything.
Exactly. Because of that hoarding, the masses experienced artificial famine. And over generations, that historical trauma birthed a deep-seated, basically paralyzing anxiety.
Yeah. So we learned to be terrified.
Right. We then built our modern institutions on top of that exact anxiety. So it becomes this self-fulfilling loop.
We fear there isn't enough, so we construct systems that encourage hoarding to protect ourselves.
Yes, which in turn creates the very scarcity we were afraid of in the first place.
That is wild. So we are dealing with an illusion, but I mean, it's an illusion that has devastating, completely tangible consequences.
Oh, absolutely tangible.
Because if mismanaged resources and institutionalized hoarding create this pervasive fear of scarcity, how does that fear cascade down into our everyday behavior?
Well, It gets dark pretty quickly.
Yeah, because if the river is dammed at the top of the mountain, the people in the valley don't just sit quietly and accept it. They panic.
Right. Panic is the natural response.
And Surah 17 anticipates this exact panic in Ayat 31. It addresses the darkest possible consequence of this economic anxiety.
The progression here, from macroeconomics directly to the sanctity of the family unit, is honestly where this text becomes incredibly sobering.
Yeah, it's heavy. Ayat 31 explicitly forbids the killing of children out of the fear of poverty.
Just let that sink in.
Right. It states categorically that the divine system, or, the natural order, if it's properly aligned, provides for both the parents and the children.
To really understand the gravity of this, though, we have to look at the historical context the Quran was originally addressing when that was revealed.
Right. Pre-Islamic Arabia.
Exactly. In pre-Islamic Arabia, there was a heavily documented practice of infanticide, specifically the burying alive of newborn daughters.
God, it is just a horrifying reality to confront.
It is, truly.
But what I find fascinating is that the source material doesn't just write this off as, ancient, inexplicable barbarism. It actually attempts to diagnose the underlying mechanism behind it.
Right. It doesn't just say they were evil. It diagnoses it as a profound failure of the economic environment and the resulting psychological collapse of the people living in it.
So it was driven by the economy.
Partially, yes. The text suggests this practice wasn't driven purely by a lack of human affection. It was driven by two overpowering forces: a distorted sense of social shame, a paralyzing absolute terror of financial ruin.
So back to that fear of scarcity.
Exactly. You have to picture a harsh desert environment where the social structure severely devalued women's economic contributions.
Right.
In that setting, a daughter was perceived by some as an insurmountable liability. The fear of future poverty was so intense, so deeply ingrained in the culture, that it literally overrode the most basic biological instinct to protect one's own offspring.
That is terrifying. But Parwez doesn't allow the modern reader the comfort of just treating this as some relic of the ancient past, does he?
No, not at all. He draws a direct, unbroken line from that ancient desert rite to contemporary society.
Yeah. He explicitly calls out modern dowry culture.
Right. Because the physical act of daring a child might be outlawed today, but the text argues the psychological rot, that precise economic anxiety that completely devalues human life, remains entirely intact.
So the mechanism is the same, even if the action changed.
Exactly. In cultures where the dowry system is prevalent today, the birth of a daughter is still, frequently, met with profound dread.
Because of the money.
Yes. From her first breath, she is calculated as a massive financial burden. She's viewed as a debt the family will eventually have to pay just to marry her off.
So the family essentially buries her potential under a mountain of financial dread.
That's a powerful way to phrase it. Yes.
The emotional environment she is raised in is poisoned by that fear of scarcity from day one.
It really is.
And, looking beyond just the dowry system, I think we can see this exact same behavioral pattern in other seemingly, sanitized modern structures.
Oh, like what?
Well, think about how a massive corporation behaves during an economic downturn.
Yeah.
They might have literally billions in reserve, right? But a rumor of a recession, just a fear of future scarcity, sparks absolute panic in the boardroom.
So what do?
Right. What do? They enact mass layoffs. They gut their research and development departments. They defund all their training programs.
I see where you're going.
They systematically kill off the future potential and innovation of their own organization. And not because they are out of money today, but because they are absolutely terrified of starving tomorrow.
That corporate behavior is actually a perfect macro-level illustration of the exact pathology Ayat 31 is warning against.
It's the exact same fear.
It is. When the fear of scarcity dictates action, the natural response is always to cannibalize the future, to protect the present.
Cannibalize the future.
Yeah. A society or a company that views its youth or its future potential as a liability rather than its greatest asset is a society that is actively in the process of dismantling itself.
This idea of cannibalizing the future makes me really question the strict literal translation of the text here.
How so?
Well, when it talks about killing children out of the fear of poverty, is Parwez arguing that this is purely about physical murder? Or is there a wider, more systemic application of this command?
That is the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And the linguistic analysis Parwez applies here is arguably one of the most vital, foundational parts of his entire interpretation.
Let's dig into that.
He delves into the specific Arabic term used in the text regarding this harm done to children. The term is Qadian Kabira.
Kati and Kabira. Okay, what does that literally translate to?
It translates roughly to a great error or a massive transgression. And Parwez argues that to read killing solely as physical murder severely limits the actual scope of this societal blueprint.
Well, right, because physical infanticide, even in deeply, deeply troubled societies, is usually a statistical anomaly.
Exactly. It requires an extreme level of desperation or outright madness.
Right, so if this text is meant to be a foundational, everyday law for a functioning society, the warning has to apply to a much more pervasive behavior.
And it does. His interpretation completely broadens the definition of killing to encompass the destruction of a child's human potential.
Okay, so how does that manifest?
The true, everyday crime, the actual Qadian Kabira that plagues modern societies, is the deprivation of education, healthcare, and developmental training, simply because the parents claim they, quote, cannot afford it.
Whoa, wait, I want to make sure I really grasp the weight of this. Parwez is interpreting the text to mean that denying a child an education because of household financial constraints it's morally and structurally equated to murder.
In the context of a society's total lifespan, yes, absolutely.
That is a staggering claim.
Think about his logic here. A human being is not just a physical, biological body,
Okay.
right? They are an intellect. They are a moral agent.
Right.
If you deny a child the tools required to develop their intellect and their skills, you are effectively killing their capacity to contribute to civilization.
You're killing who they could have been.
Exactly. You are rendering them intellectually and socially dead. Parwez takes this concept all the way to its logical conclusion, and he labels this failure to invest in youth development as a form of societal suicide.
Societal suicide. Man, that is a chilling phrase.
It's meant to be.
But it's so accurate, because starving a child's mind is a much quieter tragedy than starving their physical body.
Where there's no immediate, visible crisis.
Exactly. A physical famine generates global outrage. You get international relief efforts. But intellectual starvation, it happens in complete silence.
Yeah.
A child just quietly fades into the background. They end up working menial labor. They never realize their potential. They never innovate. They never contribute to the upward trajectory of their community.
It doesn't make the evening news.
Right. But over a generation, it absolutely guarantees the collapse of the nation.
It's the slow, invisible decay of the foundation.
Yeah.
Now, I should clarify, the text is not blind to the reality of the world here.
Yeah.
It understands that parents often do face crippling, very real financial constraints.
Right. They aren't evil, they just don't have the money.
Exactly. They aren't withholding education out of malice. They are trapped in that flawed economic flow we discussed earlier, the damned river.
Oh, right. The system is broken around them.
Yeah. And this reality leads Parwez to extrapolate a really fascinating timeline for the evolution of a just society.
Okay, so how does a society actually bridge the gap? Like between where we are now, where parents are struggling, and the standard where no child's potential is ever compromised?
He introduces what he calls the concept of the interim period.
The interim period.
Right. So currently we live in this interim period. We're in societies where the crushing, multifaceted burden of raising, educating, and securing the health of children falls squarely on the shoulders of individual parents.
Which is how most of the world operates today.
Exactly. And the problem is, if the parents are economically disadvantaged, the child inherits that disadvantage, and their potential is immediately stunted.
It's a lottery of birth.
Precisely. However, Parwez envisions a mature, fully established Islamic system, essentially a true welfare state, where this dynamic fundamentally shifts.
Okay, so what does this mature state actually look like in this regard? How does it operate?
In the fully established system, the state assumes absolute total responsibility for the basic needs, healthcare, and education of every single child.
Wait, all of it?
All of it. The state lifts the financial burden of human development off the individual parents entirely.
Let's really explore the mechanics of that, because that is a massive infrastructural commitment.
It completely rewrites the budget of a nation, yeah.
If the state is fundamentally mandated by this interpretation to provide comprehensive development for all youth, it completely reclassifies the nature of these services.
How so?
Well, in so many modern political debates, higher education or comprehensive health care, they are argued as privileges, right? Or perhaps like investments a society should make if it can balance the budget.
Right, if there's leftover money.
Exactly. But under Parwez's framework, does this basically elevate education to a fundamental human right, like equal to the right not to be physically murdered?
It doesn't just elevate it to a right, it elevates it to an absolute societal imperative.
Wow.
The underlying logic is that children are not just the private, exclusive property of their parents. They are the future constituency of the state itself.
They are the future society.
Exactly. Therefore, the society, acting through the apparatus of the state, must guarantee their development simply to ensure its own survival.
But the practical question immediately comes up. How does a state fund this without just collapsing under its own weight?
Ah.
Because if we connect this back to Ayat 29, the metaphor of the hand in liquidity we talked about earlier, the state absolutely cannot fund this if wealth is being hoarded by the top 1%.
And there it is. That is the connective tissue of the entire theory. You just nailed it.
Wait, really?
Yes. The state can only afford to take on the massive financial burden of comprehensive youth development if the economic system mandates the continuous flow of capital.
So the two concepts require each other.
Completely. By preventing artificial hoarding, the state ensures there is enough tax revenue and economic velocity to actually fund the future.
It is a closed-loop system.
Exactly. If you fail to educate the youth, you fail to maintain the intellectual capital required to run a complex economy. And that inevitably leads to moral and systemic decay.
Which brings us to a really crucial transition in the text.
Where are we heading?
Well, we have covered the flow of physical capital, right?
Yeah.
And we've covered the development of intellectual capital. But, and history proves this time and time again, a society of highly educated people with infinite resources can still totally tear itself apart if it lacks internal discipline.
Oh, absolutely.
And this leads us directly to the text's severe warnings about social integrity and the boundaries of human behavior.
Right. We are entering what we can basically call the anatomy of decline.
The anatomy of decline. Let's look at Surah 17, Ayat 32.
Okay.
This verse commands followers not to even go near Zina, which translates broadly to adultery or fornication outside of marriage. And the text labels it a fahisha, a shameful deed, and an inherently evil path.
Now, to a modern ear, this can very easily sound like standard, perhaps outdated, religious moralizing, right? Just don't do bad things.
Yeah, just typical pearl clutching.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Parwez takes this completely away from individual prudishness. He analyzes it strictly through a sociological and economic lens.
So he's looking at the systemic impact of sexual behavior.
Yes. He elevates the discourse from personal sin to civilizational survival.
Okay, that's quite a leap. How does he justify that?
To support this interpretation, Parwez leans heavily on the historical and anthropological research of J.D. Unwin, specifically his seminal 1934 book called Sex and Culture.
J.D. Unwin. Now, he is a fascinating figure to bring into a theological discussion.
He really is.
For our listeners who might not be familiar, what exactly was Unwin's methodology, and what did he conclude that makes Parwez utilize his work here?
So Unwin was a British anthropologist, and he spent years analyzing the historical records of 80 different primitive tribes and 6 known advanced civilizations.
So we're talking about like the Romans, the Greeks.
The Romans, the Greeks, the Babylonians, the Anglo-Saxons. He looked at all of them.
What was he looking for?
He was looking for patterns that dictated the rise and fall of complex societies. He wanted to know why some expanded and others collapsed.
And what did he find?
His empirical conclusion, based entirely on historical data, not theology, was that the level of cultural achievement and societal energy is directly proportional to the level of sexual discipline.
Really?
Directly proportional. Yes. Specifically, he pointed to the adherence to strict prenuptial chastity and absolute monogamy as the driving force of civilizational energy.
So Unwin argued that when a society abandons strict sexual ethics, it doesn't just undergo like a casual cultural shift. It actually loses its forward momentum.
He argued it experiences a total catastrophic collapse of intellectual, artistic, and social energy.
Wow.
Furthermore, Unwin concluded that once a society completely discards these sexual boundaries, the ensuing collapse happens incredibly fast.
How fast?
Typically within 3 generations.
3 generations. That is a historical blink of an eye.
It's nothing. It's free fall.
But I really want to understand the mechanism here. Because on the surface, it sounds disconnected. Why would personal sexual behavior dictate the macro-level energy of an entire civilization?
Right, it's hard to visualize.
Yeah.
I think we actually need a thermodynamic analogy to understand the sociological argument being made here.
Oh, I'm ready. Hit me.
Okay, think of human biological drive,
Yeah.
the sex drive, as the raw thermal energy generated by burning coal in a massive steam engine.
Okay, so raw, powerful heat.
Exactly.
Well,
Now, if that energy is just vented out into the open air, meaning if gratification is immediate, undisciplined, and scattered everywhere, the heat dissipates harmlessly into the sky.
it makes a nice cloud of steam, but it does nothing.
Right. It accomplishes absolutely zero physical work. The train doesn't move an inch.
Okay, I follow you.
However, if you take that exact same energy and you contain it within a highly pressurized boiler, which represents the strict boundaries of chastity and monogamy, the pressure builds immensely.
The energy is trapped.
Yes. And that suppressed, aggressively channeled energy is then redirected into the pistons of society.
Ah, so it powers other things.
Exactly. It powers innovation, institution building, art. It fuels the delayed gratification required for complex economic planning. And, perhaps most importantly, it powers the immense, difficult labor of maintaining a stable, generational family unit.
That completely reframes the concept of discipline for me.
How so?
Well, it isn't about suppressing human nature out of shame or guilt. It's literally about channeling a chaotic, raw force into a productive engine.
That's exactly it. It's resource management of human biology.
And Parwez actually finds evidence for this socioeconomic link in the very language of the Quran itself, doesn't he?
He does, yeah. He points to the Arabic root of the word used in the verse, fahisha.
Okay, Fisha.
The root of this word essentially denotes going beyond limits. It's an excess that becomes foul or destructive. But Parwez highlights a really subtle linguistic connection in Arabic between this concept of sexual transgression and the concept of economic weakness and stinginess.
Wait, the text draws a direct linguistic line between a lack of sexual discipline and becoming economically stingy.
It does.
How on earth do those two behaviors interconnect in practice?
The argument is deeply, deeply psychological. When a society loses its moral discipline, the family unit, which is, remember, the fundamental building block of economic stability, begins to fracture.
Right. Marriages fail, households split.
Exactly. And when that happens, trust erodes across the board. The focus of the individuals shifts away from long-term generational building, and it pivots entirely to short-term, immediate gratification.
Which means they stop investing in the future.
Right. And this loss of vital generational energy creates profound economic instability. As people feel more precarious and isolated, they become fearful.
And when people get fearful, they get insular.
Exactly. They begin to hoard. They become stingy.
It links right back to the hand tied to the neck.
Yes. And stinginess, as we discussed in the very first segment, prioritizes the self over the community, which further erodes social trust.
It is a complete vicious cycle.
A total downward spiral.
Yeah.
A lack of moral boundaries causes economic anxiety, which causes further social fracturing, which causes more hoarding.
Okay, so if the stakes are literally the survival of the civilization within 3 generations, how does the text propose we actually stop it?
That's the real challenge.
Because history shows us fairly conclusively that simply telling a population, hey, don't do this, is wildly ineffective against human biology.
Well, totally ineffective.
Yeah.
And the verse actually acknowledges that. It doesn't just say, do not commit the act. It specifically says, do not go near it.
Do not go near it.
Right. It recognizes the overwhelming gravitational power of human biology. If you get too close to the edge, gravity takes over and you fall.
So what's the systemic solution?
The solution provided in the broader Islamic framework, which Parwez elaborates on here, is all about psychological conditioning at the subconscious level.
Subconscious conditioning.
Yeah. It requires a fundamental ground-up restructuring of how members of a society view one another on a daily basis.
How does that conditioning work in practice, though? Like, what does society actually do?
The text argues that society must train its members, starting from childhood, to view all believing women in the society as either their literal sisters or mothers, and all men as brothers or fathers.
Oh, so projecting a familial bond onto strangers.
Exactly. The goal is to completely change the default lens of perception.
So you're rewiring the brain.
Right. By establishing this internal, deeply psychological familial boundary, the very idea of exploitation or transgression is stopped at the very first glance.
It stopped at the level of internal thought.
Yes. It's neutralized before it ever has the chance to manifest into a physical action or a societal fracture.
You essentially build the dam miles and miles of river long before the water ever has a chance to become a flood.
That's a perfect way to put it. You establish absolute boundaries far, far away from the physical act itself.
Man, this concept of absolute boundaries, it transitions us perfectly to the final and perhaps the most critical segment of this entire blueprint.
Right, the capstone of the whole system.
We have discussed the boundaries of capital flow, preventing hoarding. We have covered the boundaries required to protect the intellectual potential of youth from societal suicide. And we just looked at the psychological boundaries required to maintain social energy.
It's building layer upon layer.
It is. But now we arrive at the ultimate boundary, the bedrock of it all. The absolute protection of human life and the mechanics of the authority required to maintain that order.
So we are moving to segment 5, social physics, the right to life and authority.
Let's do it.
This focuses heavily on Surah 17, Ayat 33, which states, "Do not kill the soul which God has made sacred except by right meaning, except by justice."
Now, I have to say, every functioning society in human history has a law against murder. So that on its own isn't particularly revolutionary. What is revolutionary in Parwez's interpretation here is how he explains the actual administration of that justice.
Right, it's all about the mechanics of enforcement.
And it all pivots around his specific definition of one Arabic word, sultan.
Yes, sultan, which translates broadly to authority or power.
Okay.
Now, the traditional historical reading of this verse often concludes that when a person is killed unjustly, authority sultan is given to the heir of the victim to seek justice.
Meaning the family of the dead person gets the power.
Right. And in the context of the tribal societies of the past, this was very frequently interpreted as the family's right to enact personal revenge.
Literally an eye for an eye, carried out by the victim's kin.
Exactly.
Which, historically speaking, is a guaranteed recipe for endless generational blood feuds.
Oh, it's a nightmare for social stability.
Because if my brother is killed and I go kill the perpetrator in revenge, well, the perpetrator's family now feels completely justified in killing me.
And it never ends.
It's a pendulum of violence that never ever stops swinging.
Which is exactly why Parwez vehemently rejects that traditional interpretation.
He does.
Oh, completely. He argues that allowing personal revenge fundamentally destroys the fabric of a unified society. You cannot have a state if tribes are handling their own murder trials in the street.
So how does he interpret sultan?
Instead, he interprets sultan as the exclusive, unyielding domain of the state.
Okay.
The heir of the victim does not receive the right to commit violence.
And they don't get to take revenge.
No. The heir receives the authority to demand that the state enacts justice on their behalf.
So the state holds an absolute monopoly on violence and the execution of justice.
Precisely. Sultan represents the state's exclusive responsibility to ensure that what the Quran calls the law of requital is applied.
Okay, let's pause and define the law of requital for our listeners, because that sounds like a very specific, almost mathematical legal term.
It is very mathematical. In Parwez's philosophy, the law of requital, which is mukafa'i amal in Arabic, is the foundational principle that every human action has a natural, inevitable consequence.
Like physics, every action has an equal and opposite reaction.
It's exactly like physics. In a just society, the justice system isn't about angry, emotional retribution. It is an objective, mechanical balancing of the scales.
But it's completely dispassionate.
It has to be. The state must enforce the consequence of a crime fairly, objectively, and completely removing the emotional volatility of personal revenge.
Okay, that makes sense for murder. But Parwez pushes the logic of state responsibility far beyond just violent crime, doesn't he?
He takes it to a place that most modern political theorists would find shocking.
Because when he extrapolates this philosophy of sultan to property crime to theft, the implications are staggering.
It is a complete reimagining of the social contract between a citizen and the government.
Walk us through it.
So Parwez applies this exact same logic of ultimate state responsibility to theft. He argues that a citizen enters into a binding social contract with the state.
Right. I follow the law, I contribute to the economy, I pay my taxes.
Yes. And in exchange for your taxes and compliance, the state promises you security. It guarantees your safety. Therefore, if a citizen's house is robbed, Parwez argues it is not merely bad luck.
Right.
And it is absolutely not the citizen's fault for, say, having inadequate locks on their door.
Okay, so whose fault is it?
It is fundamentally a failure of the state to uphold its end of the contract. The state failed to provide the security it promised,
That is a profound shift in perspective.
isn't it?
Because if I get robbed today, in our current society, the system essentially tells me, well, you should have bought a better alarm system. Or you should have lived in a safer, more expensive neighborhood.
Right, they blame the victim.
Completely. I am left to fight with my private insurance company for months. The financial and emotional burden is entirely on me.
But under Parwez's framework, leaving that individual burden on you is a gross injustice.
Because the state broke the contract.
Exactly. Because the state failed to provide the security it charged you for, the state itself must face the immediate consequence of that failure.
Wait, so what does the state actually have to do?
According to this interpretation, the state must financially compensate the victim for their loss immediately, directly from the public treasury.
You are kidding?
Nope. The state has to make the victim whole out of its own pocket.
So the government acts as an automatic, universal insurance provider for every single citizen.
Yes.
Okay, I have to challenge the mechanics of this. I mean, practically speaking.
I figured you would.
If the state is mandated to pay out of the treasury every single time someone is robbed, wouldn't that just bankrupt the country? Like, what stops rampant insurance fraud or unchecked crime?
That exact fear is why the system is brilliant. It is exactly the pressure the system is designed to create.
What do you mean?
By forcing the state to pay for its failures out of its own treasury, you perfectly, flawlessly align the financial incentives of the government with the physical safety of the individual citizen.
Oh.
Think about it. The state literally cannot afford to be incompetent.
Because if they are incompetent, they go broke.
Exactly. If robberies are draining the public treasury, the state is financially forced to invest heavily in highly effective crime prevention.
It's survival for the government.
Right. And more importantly, it is forced to address the actual root causes of property crime.
Which are what we talked about at the beginning.
Yes. Poverty, lack of education, and the hoarding of wealth we discussed in the very first segment.
That is incredible. It creates a massive systemic feedback loop of competence.
It forces the state to care about the poorest citizen because a crime against the poorest citizen costs the state money.
Wow. Okay, so once the state has compensated the victim for the theft, what happens to the criminal? Do they just get away with it?
Not at all. Once the victim is made whole, the state has fulfilled its immediate obligation to the citizen. The citizen is fine. Then the state takes on the full burden of finding the criminal.
But not just to lock them away in a dungeon.
No, not just to punish them. The state finds them to recover the stolen wealth, to replenish the treasury, and to apply the law of requital.
So it's about restoring balance.
Exactly. The justice system changes from being this blunt, punitive weapon used mostly against the poor into an objective mechanism for restoring societal equilibrium.
Man, zooming out and looking at this entire sequence, the architecture Parwez extracts from just these 5 verses is absolutely breathtaking.
It really is.
It is exactly the intricate clockwork mechanism we envisioned at the start of the show.
It is a fully integrated, closed-loop system. Think about the journey we just took.
Right. We started with the physical economics of a household.
The absolute necessity of liquidity and the total rejection of hoarding.
And then we saw how that physical scarcity, or even just the illusion of it, breeds this psychological terror.
A terror that causes families to literally destroy the intellectual potential of their own children, the societal suicide.
Exactly. And from there, we explored how abandoning social boundaries and sexual discipline dissipates the vital generational energy needed to sustain a civilization.
It all connects. And finally, we arrived at the massive machinery of a state that holds an absolute monopoly on justice.
A state where the system itself is structurally, financially incentivized to guarantee the life and property of every single citizen.
Every gear turns the next one.
It's beautiful. If the economic flow is maintained, parents aren't terrified of poverty.
Right. And if they aren't terrified, the state can successfully step in and develop the youth.
And if the youth are educated and society maintains internal discipline, the energy and innovation of the civilization grows.
And when inevitable fractures do occur, because humans aren't perfect, the state takes the burden of restoring balance.
Rather than letting citizens tear each other apart in endless vengeance.
It is a blueprint for a society where human potential is the highest currency, and systemic accountability completely replaces individual anxiety.
Well said. This has been an incredibly dense, just fascinating deep dive into a profoundly different way of structuring human society.
It gives you a lot to think about.
It really does. And the crazy part is we have only scratched the surface of this lecture series.
Though there's so much more.
So, as a teaser for what is coming up next. In Lecture 717, we are going to look at Ayat 34 through 38.
That's a great section.
We will be covering the protection of the orphan's property, the concept of giving the full measure in economic trade, and the text's final, very stern warning against intellectual arrogance.
The command not to follow, that of which you have no knowledge.
Exactly. You will absolutely not want to miss how these concepts build on the massive foundation we laid out today.
It will be a vital continuation.
Yeah.
We'll be moving from the macro structure of the state that we just discussed right into the granular ethics of individual conduct and public integrity.
I can't wait for that one. But before we wrap up today's deep dive, I know you had one last thought.
I do. I want to leave you all with a lingering, maybe somewhat uncomfortable question to consider before next time.
Let's hear it.
We have seen today that the state, in this idealized vision, is the ultimate guarantor of our safety, our property, and our children's future.
Right. It holds the Sultan, the ultimate authority.
Exactly. But if we connect this vast unchecked power back to our very first segment, what happens when the state itself becomes the hoarder?
Oh, wow.
Right. If the system is designed to punish individuals who tie their hands to their necks, who holds the authority accountable when the government itself dams the river?
When the state creates the very artificial scarcity it was built to prevent.
Exactly. Who guards the guards?
That is a phenomenal, incredibly heavy question to end on. If the clockwork mechanism is the thing creating the drought, who actually has the power to fix the clock?
Something to chew on.
Definitely. We want to encourage you to take these concepts, this blueprint we discussed today, and overlay them onto your own life and your own society.
Look at the maps of your own institutions.
See where the artificial dams are built around you, and ask yourself what true equilibrium would actually look like. Thank you so much for joining us on this exploration. Keep questioning the structures around you, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.